Alright guys, how's it going? Welcome back. Have you ever thought, you know what I really want from my next car? I want to look like a retired Beverly Hills orthodontist. If you have, then you're in luck, because today I think I've got the perfect car for you. It's this 2004 Mercedes S-Class. This model is known as the W220, not to be confused with WD-40 because that's something else entirely. This replaced the very boxy and quite ugly, in my opinion, W140 as Mercedes' flagship car. This model ran from 1999 all the way to 2005, and during that period they sold nearly 500,000 of them. They were very popular in the US, Germany, China, basically anywhere where there were big movers and shakers who wanted something luxurious to drive around in, or rather, be driven around in. These make great chauffeur vehicles. I love these kinds of cars, they just represent such great value for money. You know, not that long ago this was a £60,000 or £70,000 car, and they depreciate so drastically they reach a point where they're just almost worthless. I know they're old now, but if you look out for a good one, there's still plenty of life left in them. It's like that old phrase, isn't it? There's many a fine tune played on an old fiddle. But be warned, they are extremely complex vehicles, and if you don't know what to look for, you might just be throwing good money after bad. I'll go into more detail later about what you need to look for, but for now, no negativity. Let's just waft around in opulence, shall we? I think the W220 S-Class is one of the most old money cars you can buy. Whenever you see one on the road, it's usually driven by some retired old guy who's done well for himself and thought, now I'm retiring, I'll treat myself to the best Mercedes money could buy. When I was in my late teens, one of my old neighbours in Spain had an S500L in white. She was a small Asian lady, so she'd have to sit about 3 inches from the dash, but every time she'd drive past I would just look on in envy, because it was so cool. It was probably the least suitable car for Spain's narrow streets, so God knows why they bought it. Probably image, I suppose, but very cool nevertheless. Many years later, my landlord in LA had an S350 AMG. Again, a beautiful car. I think they just make you look rich without trying too hard. They ooze confidence and class. Anyone who was anyone in the early 2000s had an S-Class Mercedes. Styling wise, as I touched on earlier, this was a big departure from the previous model, the W140, which was quite ungainly and boxy and I don't think has aged terribly well. This has an awful lot of road presence without being too flashy. They do look better with bigger wheels, but that is at the expense of comfort. So if you want a more comfortable S-Class, then you really need the tiny wheels. I must say, even though this looks slightly ridiculous with these tiny wheels, this S-Class is one of the most comfortable cars I've ever been in. In 2002, this car received a mild facelift, which sharpened up the styling on the front end, changed the rear lights, and also updated the ancient infotainment system. If you're in the market for an S-Class, I would recommend looking for a nice facelift example. It's just a bit easier to live with. I love the fact that as you waft along in silence and serenity, you can see the Mercedes bonnet ornament cutting through the air, just serving as a reminder that you've bought the best of the best. It's a very big car that's over 5 metres long. This one's even longer, being the limousine version, which is known simply as the L. The L gets 12 centimetres more space in the back. Now, looking at the MOT history of this particular car, I think it must have been a chauffeur vehicle, because it's got London plates, it's come from Mercedes-Benz London, and up until it was 12 or 13 years old, it had only done 20-odd thousand miles. It's also petrol rather than diesel. All the signs are there. I think this one's probably spent its first decade chauffeuring around some very wealthy people in Belgravia. Its immense length translates to a lot of interior space. It's a very spacious car, this. It just feels very bright and airy. Of course, that's helped with this particular car because it's got the nice light interior and a sunroof. These seats are so wide and soft and comfortable, they just feel like first-class loungers. The downside to that is if you take a corner a little bit too briskly, there's not an awful lot of support, but who cares? Because this is the petrol model, you can barely hear the engine working. You've got double glazed windows, which do a good job of keeping out any road or wind noise. It's just a very relaxing car to be in. As you drive along, you glance down at the rev counter and you'll notice that you rarely do more than 1500 RPM. It's all just very relaxing and quiet. It's almost like being in an art gallery. I feel as though I should talk in a very hushed tone. Everything you touch in this car, be it the armrest or the steering wheel or the seats, everything feels soft and gentle, almost malleable actually. Absolutely nothing is hard or coarse or sharp. Everything's soft. I suppose I should put you out of your misery. You probably sat there wondering about the cup holder situation. Well, it's dire. There aren't any. Not a single cup holder, which is quite disappointing. Do Germans not drink coffee? I don't get it. The actual interior styling is a little bit disappointing. It's almost like they've not put an awful lot of effort into it. If you compare this to my 2002 SL55, the interior on that car I think stunning. It's timeless, it's stylish, and it will continue to look good in 20 or 30 years time. But this just doesn't really do it for me. Everything's nicely finished, but it doesn't look particularly interesting. But I suppose it's perfectly functional. Something I've always liked about this era of S-Class is the gauges, or the gauge cluster. The display is so crisp, it's just really nice to look at. It's even better on this car because there are no warning lights, which is quite unusual for an S-Class. As with most German cars, they're quite basic with their standard equipment unless you go in there with an open checkbook. It's perfectly possible to have two S-Classes side by side, which, on the face of it, look very similar, but one could have been spec'd by Alan Harper, the other could have been spec'd by Elton John. On this particular model, I've got heated seats, sunroof, electric steering column, electric seats, cruise control, but you could have had things like adaptive cruise control, soft closed doors. It's obvious then that the first owner of this didn't think they were necessary. S-Classes in general are always way ahead of the time in terms of safety equipment and technology. You do get plenty of storage compartments in them. The door pockets are quite big. I've got storage down here, an ashtray, a glove compartment, some storage under the seats. So that's all quite practical. One thing I don't like about the interior is how far away the switches are for the electric windows. You'd have to have arms of Inspector Gadget to reach them. One thing I love about the S-Class is the steering. The steering's so light and effortless, you could almost do it with one finger. And the turning circle is so tight, it could rival a black cab. This could, I'm fairly certain, get around that tiny roundabout outside the Savoy. It just means that when you've got to do a 3-point turn, you won't break into a sweat. It's all just incredibly easy. As this car's so big and spacious, you'd expect a boot big enough to park a C-Class Mercedes in. Well, it's a little bit disappointing. It's not small by any means, but it isn't what you'd expect from a car this size. Perfectly big enough for some luggage and a set of golf clubs, but not quite as big as you'd expect. The W220 was offered with lots of engine options. The most popular one here in Europe was the 320 diesel. Now that is a cracking engine. It's a straight 6 turbo diesel, and it's both reliable and efficient. Way better than the later V6 turbo diesel which replaced it. In some markets you could also buy the S400 diesel, which used a turbo diesel V8. The 320 diesel is easily capable of about 35 or 36 miles per gallon. So that is definitely without doubt the cheapest S-Class to run. If you prefer petrol, as I do, you could have gone with a V6 or a V8 or even a V12. The V6s on offer were a 2.8 or a 3.2 or latterly a 3.7, like the one under the bonnet of this one. This produces 245 horsepower, which is adequate. It never feels quick, but there's enough power there to get you out of trouble. Actually makes a nice noise too. I would always recommend going for the V8, but it really depends on what you're planning to use your S-Class for. If you're planning to do lots of miles, then you're better off going for the diesel. If you're only going to use it at weekends, then go for the V8 or even the V12. But if you're looking for something in between, then I'd definitely recommend a V6 because it seems to be quite a good compromise. The fuel economy is quite sensible. You'll do 22, 23 miles per gallon around town, 32, 33 miles per gallon on a run. They're much better figures than you'll get from an S500. That'll average 16 or 17 around town and maybe 25, 26 on a run. If you buy one of these cars because you want to look rich, which I wouldn't recommend you do, if that is your plan, then you've got to go for an S500 or an S600. They just stink of money. This model's rear-wheel drive, as most of them were, but you could have bought it with Mercedes' 4MATIC four-wheel drive system. They're all automatic, because why would you want to change the gears yourself in an S-Class Mercedes? That just isn't what this car's about. They use either a 5-speed automatic like the one in this, or later models had a 7-speed auto. Now I prefer the 5 personally. It does a very good job. The gear changes are almost unnoticeable. It's very smooth. Another good thing about this era of S-Class is the road tax. Here in the UK it falls into the cheaper bracket of £330 a year because they're all pre-2006, rather than post-2006 where it'll set you back £600. In terms of what it's like to drive, it's a joy. It really is a pleasure to be in. The suspension just absorbs all the bumps and ripples in the road. It's not as fun to drive as a BMW 7 Series or a Jaguar XJ, but it's not as wallowy as a Lexus LS either. It's all just so effortless. The only thing it actually requires from the driver is access to their wallet. If you were to use this on a daily basis for lots of short trips, I think it would slowly annoy you. It's just too big, too difficult to park. Parking spaces here in the UK just aren't built for these kinds of cars. But for longer trips, it's superb. I really can't think of anything for this sort of money that would provide this level of refinement and comfort. However, it isn't all good news. These cars are incredibly complex, so we better talk about reliability, hadn't we? The engines and gearboxes are tried and tested, and they are very reliable if looked after. It's everything else in between that can let you down. The wiring in this car is so immense, if you stripped it all out, it would actually wrap around the globe twice. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but it sounds plausible, doesn't it? My point is, these cars are complicated. So the best piece of advice I can give you is find a decent Mercedes specialist and stick with them. Have them do the servicing and have them look after it. Because the first time you see a warning light on the dash, which will happen, that's quite common, you will be scratching your head trying to figure out why it's on. Whereas if you take it to a Mercedes specialist, they will get straight to it. I use a company called SPR in Stockport who are excellent. They always get straight to the point, and it just saves you all that time and money trying to figure out what the problem could be. For example, these cars have 2 batteries, so you could get error messages on the dash just if one of the batteries is on its way out, and you'd have no idea, would you? You've got to be slightly brave to buy a car like this. I mean, to be fair, the same is true with any aging luxury vehicle. They won't be as reliable as a Honda Jazz. But that just kind of goes without saying, doesn't it? But if you're interested in buying an aging luxury barge like this, you've got to go into it with your eyes open. General servicing won't cost you the earth. That's all fairly standard stuff. Tyres, discs, pads, all that sort of stuff. Won't be any more than any standard car. Other parts aren't that expensive either. And because they're so old now, you'll be able to get parts off eBay or from scrapyards. So that shouldn't be a problem. But like I say, just stick with a Mercedes specialist. That's the best piece of advice I can give. Mercedes petrol engines do have a tendency to wear out crankshaft sensors, so if you have any issue starting your car, I'd try that first. Early models suffered terribly with rust, which I think is totally unforgivable for a 60 or 70 grand car. But do check the wheel arches and wings for the old tin worm. Another thing to look out for, given their age, the wheels will probably need refurbing. That'll set you back about £200. The suspension, as good as it is at ironing out all the bumps in the road, is needlessly complicated. Some used an Airmatic system and others use the ABC hydraulic system. Both are very expensive to repair, so you want to make sure that it all works as it should. It's adjustable, so have a play around with it, make sure it raises and lowers as it should. Happily though, there are lots of companies out there on the internet who will refurbish parts, so if it does fail, which it might, there are companies out there that can save you a few quid on the repairs. Something else to mention, which is a bit of a minor issue, but the wing mirrors always seem to suffer from jaundice. If you have a look at this one, it's like looking at an old photo. Everything's sepia. If you're looking to buy one, make sure you're looking at one with full service history, but more specifically, make sure it's got full Mercedes or full Mercedes specialist history. It'll just give you a good idea that it's been looked after by somebody who knows what they're doing. You don't want to buy one of these things that's got any sort of deferred maintenance, because it will just become a total money pit. Ask me how I know that. There's nothing more expensive than a cheap Mercedes. I've been there, done that, and got the miserable t-shirt. If you compare this to, say, a Lexus LS 430, everything feels more custom made, more bespoke. Everything's softer and nicer. But there are some things which just haven't stood the test of time as well as the LS. This area around here, for example, where the lights are, it's gone all sticky and just looks a mess. They've used the exact same materials on the steering wheel buttons, which also look a mess. You just wouldn't get that from the LS. The Lexus LS is often thought of as the most reliable luxury car you can buy, but they still have the common issues. So if you're interested in buying one of these luxury barges, you've got to do your homework. If you Google S-Class Mercedes problems, you'll end up reading something longer than the Magna Carta, so I wouldn't advise you do that. It will totally frighten you off buying one. The same is true if you Google BMW 7 Series problems, Audi A8 problems, Lexus LS problems. So you've really got to buy a nice one with a good service history, make sure that everything works, and keep a couple of grand back for any possible repairs. Find a local Mercedes specialist and stick with them, and keep your fingers crossed. That's pretty much as I can say. Used prices here in the UK start at as little as £1,000, but you really need to avoid those at all costs. Buying the cheapest S-Class doesn't make you big or clever, but it will cost you much more in the long run, so avoid those. You need to spend somewhere between £3,000 and £5,000 and you'll get yourself a good one. I'd try and find a nice low mileage one that's done 60 or 70,000 miles, because it should have plenty of life left in it. And really, if you do that, keep a couple of grand back for repairs, you can drive around in something which was 15 years ago the best thing money could buy for the same sort of money as a used Ford Focus. It's a no-brainer, really. So thank you once again for watching. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done already. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'll leave the link below. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know, and I'll do my best to get back to you. So yeah, cheers guys. I'll see you next time.